Question 1. Research into a penetration test reveals that the tester, under significant time pressure to deliver a final report, decided to only broadly summarize the exploitation and post-exploitation phases, omitting specific command line arguments, tool configurations, and the exact sequence of actions taken during these critical stages. This decision was made to expedite the report generation process. Considering the GIAC penetration tester, GPEN, examinations focus on professional conduct and thoroughness. Which of the following approaches to documenting these phases would be considered the most ethically sound and professionally responsible? Option A. Summarizing the exploitation and post-exploitation phases by listing the types of vulnerabilities exploited and the general outcomes achieved, without detailing the specific technical steps taken. Option B. Delegating the detailed documentation of exploitation and post-exploitation to a junior team member who can complete it after the main report has been submitted, ensuring the initial report meets the deadline. Option C. Focusing documentation solely on the identified vulnerabilities and their business impact, assuming the technical details of exploitation are implied and not critical for the client's understanding. Option D. Documenting the exploitation and post-exploitation phases with detailed step-by-step accounts, including specific commands executed, tool configurations used, timestamps, and any relevant output or error messages, even if it requires additional time beyond the initial deadline. Correct answer is D. Documenting the exploitation and post-exploitation phases with detailed step-by-step accounts, including specific commands executed, tool configurations used, timestamps, and any relevant output or error messages, even if it requires additional time beyond the initial deadline. Explanation. This scenario presents a common ethical and professional challenge in penetration testing, balancing the need for thorough documentation with the practical realities of time constraints and the dynamic nature of an engagement. The core of the challenge lies in ensuring that all actions, especially those involving exploitation and post-exploitation, are meticulously recorded without compromising the efficiency or effectiveness of the test. The GPEN certification emphasizes the importance of professional conduct and adherence to established methodologies, which inherently includes robust documentation practices. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes comprehensive and accurate record-keeping as a fundamental requirement for any penetration test. This aligns with the ethical obligation to provide a clear and verifiable account of the testing process and its findings. Detailed documentation serves multiple critical purposes. It allows for accurate reporting of vulnerabilities, provides evidence for remediation efforts, supports post-test analysis and learning, and is essential for demonstrating compliance with any relevant regulatory frameworks or contractual obligations. For a GPEN professional, this meticulousness is a hallmark of competence and integrity. An incorrect approach that omits or inadequately documents exploitation and post-exploitation activities is professionally unacceptable for several reasons. Firstly, it violates the principle of transparency and accountability. Without proper documentation, it becomes impossible to reconstruct the testing process, verify the findings, or assess the full impact of discovered vulnerabilities. This lack of detail can lead to disputes with the client, hinder effective remediation, and potentially expose the tester to liability. Furthermore, such omissions can be interpreted as a failure to meet professional standards and could have implications for certifications and future engagements. Ethically, it represents a dereliction of duty to provide a complete and honest assessment. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a proactive approach to documentation. Testers should establish a clear documentation strategy before the engagement begins, outlining what information needs to be captured at each stage. This includes leveraging tools that can automate logging where possible, but also recognizing the need for manual annotation to provide context and detail. During the engagement, regular checkpoints for documentation review should be incorporated. If time constraints become a significant factor, the professional should communicate this to the client and discuss potential adjustments to the scope or timeline, rather than compromising on the quality of documentation. The ultimate goal is to deliver a comprehensive and defensible report that accurately reflects the testing performed. Question 2. The performance metrics show that the penetration test has uncovered a critical vulnerability on a system that was explicitly excluded from the agreed-upon scope document due to its perceived low risk. The tester has the capability to exploit this vulnerability and gain further access, but doing so would exceed the defined boundaries of the engagement. Which of the following actions best represents professional conduct and adherence to regulatory frameworks relevant to penetration testing? Option A. Proceed with exploiting the vulnerability on the excluded system to demonstrate the full extent of the risk, assuming the client would appreciate the thoroughness. Option B. Immediately cease testing on the excluded system and document the finding and the scope limitation in the final report, recommending the client to conduct a separate, authorized assessment of this system. Option C. Inform the client of the discovery and request immediate written authorization to test the excluded system, pausing all further testing on that specific system until authorization is received. Option D. Attempt to gain authorization from the client to test the excluded system while continuing to probe its defenses without active exploitation. The correct answer is B. Immediately cease testing on the excluded system and document the finding and the scope limitation in the final report, recommending the client to conduct a separate, authorized assessment of this system. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because the penetration tester must balance the need for comprehensive testing with the strict limitations imposed by the client and regulatory compliance. Misinterpreting or exceeding the agreed-upon scope can lead to legal repercussions, reputational damage, and a breach of trust, all of which are critical considerations within the GIAC penetration tester (GPEN) framework, which emphasizes ethical conduct and adherence to client agreements. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes clear, documented communication and adherence to the agreed-upon scope. This aligns with the GPEN emphasis on professionalism and ethical conduct. By obtaining explicit written authorization for any deviations, the tester ensures that all activities are sanctioned, minimizing legal and ethical risks. This proactive communication also fosters a stronger client relationship and demonstrates a commitment to responsible security testing. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with testing beyond the agreed-upon scope without explicit authorization is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It constitutes unauthorized access, which is illegal and unethical. This violates the principle of informed consent and can lead to severe legal penalties. Furthermore, it undermines the integrity of the penetration testing profession and the trust placed in certified professionals. Another incorrect approach, that of stopping all testing immediately upon encountering a potential scope boundary without seeking clarification or authorization, while seemingly cautious, can be professionally deficient. It may lead to an incomplete assessment, failing to identify critical vulnerabilities that, while potentially outside the initial scope, pose a significant risk to the client's overall security posture. This can result in a missed opportunity to provide essential security advice, potentially leaving the client exposed. The professional decision-making process should involve a nuanced assessment of risk and a commitment to open communication with the client to clarify ambiguities and obtain necessary approvals before proceeding or halting. Question 3. The monitoring system demonstrates a significant volume of unencrypted data traversing the internal network. During a penetration test, a security analyst is tasked with analyzing this traffic using Wireshark to identify potential vulnerabilities. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the professional and regulatory requirements of a penetration test focused on network protocol analysis within a defined scope? Option A. Systematically capture and analyze packets containing sensitive information, looking for clear text credentials, personally identifiable information, PI, or proprietary data that could be exploited. Correlate these findings with known protocol weaknesses and potential attack vectors, ensuring all analysis remains strictly within the agreed-upon network segments and systems defined in the engagement scope. Option B. Assume that the unencrypted data is benign and proceed with other penetration testing activities, as the primary goal is to find active exploits rather than passively analyze data content. Option C. Immediately begin analyzing traffic on all network segments, regardless of the defined scope, to identify any and all potential security risks, as the presence of unencrypted data suggests a widespread security issue. Option D. Focus solely on identifying the top bandwidth consumers on the network to understand general network usage patterns, without specifically looking for exploitable vulnerabilities in the unencrypted traffic. The correct answer is A. Systematically capture and analyze packets containing sensitive information, looking for clear text credentials, personally identifiable information, PI, or proprietary data that could be exploited. Correlate these findings with known protocol weaknesses and potential attack vectors, ensuring all analysis remains strictly within the agreed-upon network segments and systems defined in the engagement scope. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a penetration tester to balance the need for thorough network traffic analysis to identify vulnerabilities with the critical requirement of adhering strictly to the defined scope and legal boundaries of the engagement. Misinterpreting or exceeding the scope can lead to legal repercussions, reputational damage, and a failed assessment. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all actions taken are justifiable, documented, and directly contribute to the objectives of the penetration test as agreed upon with the client. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the systematic and authorized examination of network traffic within the agreed-upon scope. By focusing on identifying anomalies and potential vulnerabilities using tools like Wireshark and correlating these findings with known attack vectors and protocol weaknesses, the tester is directly addressing the core objectives of a network protocol analysis phase in a penetration test. This method ensures that the findings are relevant, actionable, and obtained through legitimate means, aligning with the ethical and professional standards expected of a GIAC-certified penetration tester. Adherence to the scope is paramount, as unauthorized access or analysis outside of it constitutes a breach of trust and potentially illegal activity. An incorrect approach that involves analyzing traffic outside the agreed-upon scope, even if it reveals vulnerabilities, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This is because it violates the explicit terms of the engagement contract and potentially the legal framework governing data privacy and unauthorized access. Such actions could be construed as unauthorized surveillance or data interception, leading to severe legal penalties and a complete loss of client trust. Another incorrect approach, such as focusing solely on identifying high-bandwidth users without correlating this to security risks, fails to meet the penetration testing objective of vulnerability discovery. This approach is inefficient and does not demonstrate the application of network protocol analysis for security purposes, thus not fulfilling the professional obligation to identify and report on security weaknesses. A third incorrect approach, which involves making assumptions about protocol behavior without empirical analysis of captured traffic, is fundamentally flawed. This bypasses the essential step of evidence gathering through network protocol analysis, leading to potentially inaccurate conclusions and recommendations, thereby failing to provide a valuable security assessment. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding and strict adherence to the engagement scope. Before commencing any analysis, a thorough review of the statement of work and any legal agreements is essential. During the analysis, continuous self-assessment of actions against the scope is crucial. If a potential area of interest arises that falls outside the scope, the professional must immediately pause, document the observation, and consult with the client or engagement manager for explicit authorization before proceeding. All findings must be directly linked to the penetration testing objectives, and the tools used, such as Wireshark, should be applied in a manner that is both effective for vulnerability identification and compliant with legal and ethical guidelines. Documentation of all steps, findings, and decisions is critical for accountability and reporting. Question 4. Which approach would be most effective in establishing and maintaining secure and efficient communication channels for reporting penetration testing findings and coordinating activities, adhering to professional ethical standards and the implicit requirements of a penetration testing engagement? Option A. Immediately report all discovered vulnerabilities directly to the primary point of contact via personal email as soon as they are identified, regardless of their severity or pre-established communication protocols. Option B. Develop a comprehensive communication plan collaboratively with the client during the engagement scoping phase, detailing reporting frequency, escalation procedures for critical vulnerabilities, authorized recipients, and secure communication methods, and adhere strictly to this plan throughout the engagement. Option C. Share all findings and ongoing progress updates through unsecured instant messaging applications with any client personnel who express interest. Option D. Wait until the final penetration test report is compiled to disclose all findings, including critical vulnerabilities, to the client. The correct answer is B. Develop a comprehensive communication plan collaboratively with the client during the engagement scoping phase, detailing reporting frequency, escalation procedures for critical vulnerabilities, authorized recipients, and secure communication methods, and adhere strictly to this plan throughout the engagement. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing: the need for clear, timely, and secure communication of sensitive findings to a client, while adhering to established protocols and regulatory expectations. The professional challenge lies in balancing the urgency of reporting critical vulnerabilities with the need for accuracy, context, and authorized dissemination, all within the framework of a penetration testing engagement. This requires careful judgment to avoid miscommunication, unauthorized disclosure, or premature notification that could compromise the engagement or client security. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured, predefined communication plan that aligns with industry standards and potential regulatory requirements for incident reporting and data handling. Establishing communication channels and protocols before the engagement ensures that all parties understand how and when information will be shared, who the authorized recipients are, and the expected format of reports. This proactive measure minimizes ambiguity, facilitates efficient incident response by the client, and demonstrates a commitment to professional conduct and due diligence, which are implicitly expected under general professional ethics and potentially under frameworks like the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. Though not explicitly mandated by GPEN jurisdiction, it informs best practices. The focus on authorized personnel and secure channels directly addresses the sensitive nature of penetration test findings. An incorrect approach that involves immediate, ad hoc reporting of all findings directly to the primary point of contact, without prior agreement on protocols, fails to account for the client's internal communication structures and potential need for tiered reporting or verification. This could lead to information overload, misinterpretation, or bypass of internal security teams, creating an ethical and professional lapse. Another incorrect approach, such as waiting until the final report to disclose critical vulnerabilities, is professionally unacceptable as it delays the client's ability to remediate urgent risks, potentially exposing them to significant harm and violating the implicit duty of care. Furthermore, communicating findings through unsecured or unauthorized channels, such as personal email or unencrypted messaging, represents a severe regulatory and ethical failure, risking data exfiltration and violating client confidentiality and data protection principles. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's specific requirements and existing security policies during the initial scoping and planning phases. This includes collaboratively developing a communication plan that outlines reporting frequency, escalation paths for critical findings, authorized recipients, and secure communication methods. Throughout the engagement, adherence to this plan is paramount, with any deviations requiring explicit client agreement. The professional's responsibility is to provide actionable intelligence in a timely and secure manner, respecting the client's operational context and regulatory obligations. Question 5. The review process indicates that a penetration testing team is tasked with assessing the security posture of a U.S.-based financial institution. The team is considering several approaches for conducting vulnerability scans using tools like Nessus. Which of the following approaches best aligns with U.S. regulatory compliance and professional ethical standards for this engagement? Option A. Perform authenticated scans using provided credentials, carefully configuring scan policies to minimize network impact and avoid disruptive checks, and ensuring scans are scheduled during agreed-upon maintenance windows. Option B. Conduct aggressive, unauthenticated scans across all network segments to quickly identify the broadest range of potential vulnerabilities, regardless of potential service interruptions. Option C. Utilize a default, unauthenticated scan configuration without prior client consultation to simulate an external attacker's initial reconnaissance phase. Option D. Run a high-intensity, broad-spectrum scan using default settings without specific regard for the target system's operational criticality or the client's stated risk tolerance. The correct answer is A. Perform authenticated scans using provided credentials, carefully configuring scan policies to minimize network impact and avoid disruptive checks, and ensuring scans are scheduled during agreed-upon maintenance windows. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing, balancing the need for comprehensive vulnerability identification with the potential for disruption and the requirement to adhere to strict regulatory frameworks. The challenge lies in selecting and configuring vulnerability scanning tools in a manner that is both effective in uncovering weaknesses and compliant with the client's operational constraints and applicable U.S. regulations. The professional must exercise careful judgment to avoid causing service degradation, while ensuring the scan results are actionable and defensible from a compliance perspective. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves configuring the vulnerability scanner to perform authenticated scans with appropriate credentials. This is best professional practice because it allows the scanner to access internal system information, such as installed software versions, patch levels, and configuration settings, which are crucial for accurate vulnerability detection. Authenticated scans significantly reduce false positives and false negatives, leading to a more precise understanding of the actual risk posture. From a U.S. regulatory perspective, this approach aligns with the principles of due diligence and risk management mandated by frameworks like NIST SB 800-53, which emphasize understanding and mitigating system vulnerabilities. It also supports compliance with data protection regulations, e.g., HIPAA for healthcare, GLBA for financial services, by ensuring that security assessments are thorough and identify potential pathways for unauthorized access or data compromise. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that involves performing unauthenticated scans without proper authorization or client notification is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Unauthenticated scans provide a limited view of vulnerabilities, mimicking an external attacker's perspective, but failing to identify many internal weaknesses. Ethically, conducting scans without explicit consent is a breach of trust and could be construed as unauthorized access, leading to legal repercussions. From a regulatory standpoint, this approach fails to meet the due diligence requirements of many U.S. laws and standards, as it does not provide a comprehensive assessment of the organization's security posture. Another incorrect approach is to run aggressive, unauthenticated scans that could lead to service disruption. While the intent might be to simulate a denial-of-service attack or to quickly identify easily exploitable vulnerabilities, this method carries a high risk of impacting system availability. This directly violates the principle of minimizing harm, a core ethical tenet for penetration testers. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing critical infrastructure or financial services, often have stringent requirements for maintaining service availability. Causing an outage through reckless scanning would likely result in non-compliance and potential penalties. Finally, using a vulnerability scanner without understanding its specific configuration options and potential impact on target systems is professionally unacceptable. Each scanner has different modes of operation, intensity levels, and network traffic generation capabilities. Failing to tailor the scan to the client's environment and risk tolerance demonstrates a lack of professionalism and technical competence. This can lead to inaccurate results, system instability, and a failure to meet the objectives of the engagement, thereby not fulfilling the due diligence expected under U.S. regulatory requirements. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based approach, starting with a thorough understanding of the client's environment, business objectives, and regulatory obligations. Before initiating any scanning activity, a detailed scope of work and an authorization form must be agreed upon, clearly defining what can and cannot be tested, and the acceptable level of risk for service disruption. Vulnerability scanners should be configured to perform authenticated scans whenever possible, with credentials provided by the client. Scan intensity and timing should be carefully managed to minimize impact on production systems. Regular communication with the client throughout the engagement is crucial to address any unexpected issues and ensure continued alignment with objectives and compliance requirements. Question 6. The analysis reveals that passive reconnaissance has uncovered a significant amount of publicly accessible information about the target organization, including employee social media profiles, publicly listed IP address ranges, and details about their web application technologies. Which of the following approaches best represents a professional and ethical next step for a penetration tester operating under a defined scope and adhering to U.S. regulatory frameworks for information security assessments? Option A. Synthesize the gathered OSINT to identify potential attack vectors and areas for further investigation during the active testing phase, focusing on publicly exposed services and potential misconfigurations. Option B. Immediately attempt to exploit any identified vulnerabilities in the web application technologies using the social media profiles to craft targeted phishing attacks. Option C. Purchase additional, more sensitive information about the organization's internal network architecture from dark web marketplaces to supplement the OSINT findings. Option D. Use the harvested employee email addresses to send unsolicited communications to all identified personnel, inquiring about their security practices. The correct answer is A. Synthesize the gathered OSINT to identify potential attack vectors and areas for further investigation during the active testing phase, focusing on publicly exposed services and potential misconfigurations. Explanation. The analysis reveals a common scenario in penetration testing, where the initial passive reconnaissance phase uncovers a wealth of publicly available information about a target organization. The professional challenge lies in effectively and ethically leveraging this OSINT to build a comprehensive attack surface model without crossing legal or ethical boundaries. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between legitimate information gathering and intrusive or unauthorized activities. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it focuses on synthesizing OSINT data to identify potential vulnerabilities and attack vectors that can be further investigated during active testing phases, strictly within the agreed-upon scope of the engagement. This aligns with the ethical guidelines of penetration testing, which emphasize conducting assessments in a controlled and authorized manner. By prioritizing the identification of publicly exposed services, potential misconfigurations, and employee digital footprints, the tester can develop a more targeted and efficient testing strategy, maximizing the value of the engagement for the client while minimizing risk. This approach adheres to the principle of least privilege and ensures that all actions are justifiable and documented. An incorrect approach that involves directly attempting to exploit identified vulnerabilities or gain unauthorized access to systems based solely on OSINT data represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This constitutes unauthorized access, which is illegal and a direct violation of professional conduct. It bypasses the crucial active testing and authorization phases, potentially causing harm to the target organization and exposing the penetration tester to legal repercussions. Another incorrect approach, such as using harvested email addresses for unsolicited communication or phishing attempts outside the defined scope, is also a severe ethical breach and may violate data privacy regulations. This constitutes misuse of collected information and can damage the reputation of both the tester and the client. Furthermore, an approach that involves purchasing or acquiring sensitive information from illicit sources, even if publicly available through legitimate OSINT means, crosses ethical lines and can be legally problematic, potentially implicating the tester in activities that support criminal enterprises. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes scope adherence, legal compliance, and ethical conduct. This involves a continuous assessment of the information gathered against the agreed-upon rules of engagement. Any action taken should be directly related to the authorized testing objectives. If OSINT reveals information that suggests a critical vulnerability, the next step should be to plan for its controlled verification during the active testing phase, not immediate exploitation. Documentation of all gathered information and the rationale for its use is paramount for transparency and accountability. Question 7. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood of a critical impact if an identified rogue wireless access point is exploited, potentially leading to unauthorized network access and data exfiltration. The engagement scope explicitly permits the identification and reporting of wireless vulnerabilities, but requires explicit client authorization for any active exploitation or network interference. What is the most professional and ethically sound course of action? Option A. Document the rogue access point, its potential risks, and immediately seek explicit written authorization from the client to either attempt exploitation to demonstrate impact or to disable it. Option B. Ignore the rogue access point as it was not explicitly listed as a target for active exploitation in the initial scope. Option C. Immediately disable the rogue access point to mitigate the identified risk. Option D. Immediately attempt to exploit the rogue access point to confirm the risk and gather evidence of its exploitability. Correct answer is A. Document the rogue access point, its potential risks, and immediately seek explicit written authorization from the client to either attempt exploitation to demonstrate impact or to disable it. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in wireless penetration testing, balancing the discovery of critical vulnerabilities with the potential for unintended disruption and the need to adhere to strict testing scopes. The professional challenge lies in accurately assessing the risk posed by identified wireless vulnerabilities, such as weak encryption on an access point, and determining the most appropriate and ethical course of action within the defined engagement parameters. This requires a nuanced understanding of the potential impact of exploitation, the client's risk tolerance, and the legal and ethical boundaries of penetration testing. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough risk assessment and clear communication with the client before proceeding with any potentially disruptive actions. This aligns with the ethical guidelines of penetration testing, which emphasize minimizing harm and operating within agreed-upon scopes. By documenting the vulnerability, assessing its exploitability and potential impact, and then seeking explicit authorization for further action, the tester demonstrates professionalism, accountability, and a commitment to client trust. This process ensures that the client is fully informed and can make an educated decision about how to proceed, thereby managing their own risk effectively. An incorrect approach that involves immediately attempting to exploit a WPA2 vulnerability without prior authorization would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This action could lead to service disruption, data loss, or legal repercussions for both the tester and the client, violating the principle of do no harm and exceeding the typical scope of a passive or reconnaissance-focused phase of testing. Similarly, ignoring a rogue access point identified during the test, even if it appears benign, is an ethical lapse. Rogue access points represent a significant security risk, and failing to report them, even if not explicitly within the initial scope, can be seen as a dereliction of professional duty, potentially leaving the client exposed to further compromise. Another incorrect approach, such as immediately disabling the rogue access point, is also problematic as it constitutes unauthorized interference with the client's network infrastructure, potentially causing operational issues and legal ramifications. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the engagement scope and objectives. This is followed by a systematic process of reconnaissance, vulnerability identification, and risk assessment. For each identified vulnerability, the tester must evaluate its potential impact, exploitability, and the likelihood of successful exploitation. Crucially, before any active exploitation that could cause disruption, the tester must consult their findings with the client, clearly articulate the risks and potential benefits of exploitation, and obtain explicit written authorization. This iterative process of assessment, communication, and authorization is fundamental to responsible and effective penetration testing. Question 8. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a client's firewall is a significant barrier to testing internal network segmentation. To assess the effectiveness of the firewall in preventing unauthorized lateral movement, a penetration tester needs to demonstrate the ability to bypass it. Considering the U.S. regulatory framework and ethical guidelines for penetration testing, which of the following methods is the most appropriate and professionally sound approach to test the firewall's evasion resistance? Option A. Manipulating the timing and sequence of network packets to exploit potential race conditions in the firewall's stateful inspection engine, without documenting the specific exploit or its potential impact. Option B. Utilizing a known exploit for a specific firewall vulnerability that has not been disclosed to the client, with the intent of demonstrating a critical weakness. Option C. Employing fragmentation techniques to split legitimate traffic into smaller packets that the firewall may not inspect as thoroughly, ensuring this is done within a predefined, documented test plan with explicit client approval for this specific testing method. Option D. Establishing a covert encrypted tunnel through the firewall using an unapproved protocol to access internal resources, without prior notification to the client, to simulate an advanced persistent threat. The correct answer is C. Employing fragmentation techniques to split legitimate traffic into smaller packets that the firewall may not inspect as thoroughly, ensuring this is done within a predefined, documented test plan with explicit client approval for this specific testing method. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a penetration tester to balance the technical objective of bypassing a firewall with the ethical and legal obligations to operate within the scope of authorization and adhere to relevant U.S. regulations. The core of the challenge lies in determining the most appropriate method for achieving a testing objective when multiple technical avenues exist, each with varying levels of risk and potential for misinterpretation or unauthorized access. Careful judgment is required to select a technique that is effective for testing firewall defenses without inadvertently crossing legal or ethical boundaries. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a controlled and documented method of testing firewall evasion. Using a pre-approved, documented technique like fragmentation within a controlled test environment, with explicit client consent and clear logging, ensures that the penetration test remains within its authorized scope. This aligns with the principles of responsible disclosure and ethical hacking, as mandated by professional standards and implicitly supported by U.S. cybersecurity regulations that emphasize authorized access and risk mitigation. By focusing on techniques that are designed for testing and are executed with transparency, the tester demonstrates adherence to professional conduct and minimizes the risk of unintended consequences or legal repercussions. An incorrect approach involving covert tunneling without explicit authorization or clear documentation poses significant regulatory and ethical failures. Such actions could be construed as unauthorized access, violating laws like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFA, in the U.S. Ethically, it breaches the trust placed in the penetration tester by the client and deviates from the principles of ethical hacking, which demand transparency and adherence to agreed-upon methodologies. Another incorrect approach, such as manipulating protocols in a manner that mimics malicious activity without a clear testing objective or prior agreement, risks triggering security alerts and potentially leading to a denial of service condition or misidentification as a genuine threat. This not only undermines the testing objective, but also creates a false positive incident for the client's security team, wasting valuable resources and potentially damaging the client's operational continuity. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the testing scope and objectives, a risk assessment of potential evasion techniques, and clear communication with the client. Before employing any firewall evasion technique, a penetration tester must 1. Confirm the technique is within the agreed-upon scope of work and has explicit client authorization. 2. Assess the potential impact and risks associated with the technique, including the possibility of detection, disruption, or misinterpretation. 3. Document the chosen technique, the rationale for its selection, and the expected outcomes. 4. Ensure that all testing activities are logged and auditable. This systematic approach ensures that the penetration test is both effective in identifying vulnerabilities and compliant with legal and ethical standards. Question 9. During the evaluation of a client's network infrastructure, the stakeholder has explicitly requested a stealthy approach to network scanning to minimize the risk of detection by their security monitoring systems. Considering the GIAC penetration tester, GPEN, examination's emphasis on responsible and effective testing within a defined scope, which of the following combinations of network scanning techniques would best align with the stakeholder's request for stealth while still providing valuable reconnaissance information? Option A, SYN scan and FIN scan. Option B, TCP connect scan and UDP scan. Option C, null scan and XMS scan. Option D, idle scan and SYN scan. The correct answer is A, SYN scan and FIN scan. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing, balancing the need for comprehensive network reconnaissance with the imperative to operate within legal and ethical boundaries, particularly concerning potential disruption and unauthorized access. The stakeholders' request for a stealthy approach, while understandable from a business perspective, directly conflicts with the inherent invasiveness of certain network scanning techniques. The challenge lies in selecting methods that yield sufficient information for the penetration test without triggering intrusion detection systems or violating the scope of engagement, which could lead to legal repercussions or damage to the client relationship. Adherence to the GPEN implied ethical and legal framework, which prioritizes authorized and responsible testing, is paramount. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves utilizing SYN scans and FIN scans. A SYN scan, half-open scan, is often preferred in stealthy engagements because it does not complete the TCP three-way handshake. By sending a SYN packet and analyzing the response, SYNAC or RSD, the tester can infer port states without establishing a full connection, making it less likely to be logged by the target system as a completed connection. A FIN scan, which sends a FIN packet, is also a stealthier technique that exploits differences in how various operating systems handle unexpected packets. When sent to a closed port, a FIN packet should elicit an RSD response. If no response is received, it suggests the port might be open or filtered by a firewall. These techniques, when used judiciously and within the agreed-upon scope, represent best professional practice by minimizing the footprint and potential for detection, while still gathering essential network information. This aligns with the ethical obligation to conduct testing responsibly and avoid unnecessary disruption. Incorrect approaches analysis. A TCP Connect scan is generally not considered stealthy. It completes the full TCP three-way handshake, establishing a connection. This is more easily detected and logged by target systems and intrusion detection systems, potentially violating the spirit of a stealthy request and increasing the risk of detection. A null scan, which sends a packet with no flags set, and an XMES scan, which sends a packet with the FIN, PSH, and URG flag set, are designed to elicit responses from closed ports. However, their effectiveness and stealthiness can vary significantly depending on the target operating system. While they can be stealthy, they are often less reliable for determining port states compared to SYN or FIN scans and can still be detected by sophisticated monitoring. Their primary failure in this context is their potential for less predictable results and the risk of being flagged as anomalous traffic, even if not a full connection. A UDP scan is inherently noisy and can be slow. UDP is a connectionless protocol, and determining the state of UDP ports often involves sending UDP packets and waiting for ICMP port unreachable messages or no response. The lack of a handshake makes it difficult to confirm port states definitively, and the process can generate significant network traffic, making it easily detectable and not aligned with a stealthy objective. An idle scan, or zombie scan, relies on a vulnerable, unmonitored host, the zombie, to spoof packets. While it can be very stealthy from the perspective of the scanning machine, it requires specific conditions to be met on the target network, a predictable IP ID sequence on the zombie, and is complex to implement. Its failure in this context is its reliance on specific, often unavailable network conditions, and its potential to be detected if the zombie host's activity is monitored or if the spoofed packets are analyzed. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach this scenario by first clarifying the exact scope and objectives of the engagement with the stakeholder. A discussion about the definition of stealthy and the acceptable level of risk for detection is crucial. The decision-making process should involve 1. Understanding the client's business context and the potential impact of detection. 2. Identifying the specific information required from the network scan. 3. Evaluating the technical capabilities and limitations of various scanning techniques in relation to the target environment. 4. Prioritizing techniques that offer a balance between information gathering and minimizing detection probability, such as SYN and FIN scans. 5. Documenting the chosen methodology and the rationale behind it for the client. 6. Continuously monitoring for signs of detection and adjusting the approach as necessary, always within the agreed-upon scope. This systematic approach ensures that the penetration test is conducted effectively, ethically, and in a manner that respects the client's operational environment. Question 10. The efficiency study reveals that a web application penetration test has identified numerous vulnerabilities, ranging from low to critical severity. To best serve the client and facilitate effective remediation, which of the following approaches to reporting the findings is most professionally sound and aligned with regulatory expectations for risk assessment? Option A. Report the total number of vulnerabilities discovered, categorized by their technical severity, e.g., low, medium, high, critical, without further analysis of their potential business consequences. Option B. Focus exclusively on the technical severity ratings assigned by automated scanning tools, as these are objective measures of vulnerability criticality, and present these ratings without additional context or impact analysis. Option C. Provide a comprehensive technical write-up of every single vulnerability found, detailing the exact steps to reproduce it, but without any assessment of the potential business impact or risk to the organization. Option D. Quantify the potential business impact of each vulnerability by considering its effect on confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and then prioritize remediation efforts based on this assessed business risk, aligning with organizational objectives and regulatory compliance requirements. The correct answer is D. Quantify the potential business impact of each vulnerability by considering its effect on confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and then prioritize remediation efforts based on this assessed business risk, aligning with organizational objectives and regulatory compliance requirements. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in web application penetration testing, where the immediate technical findings of a vulnerability assessment may not fully convey the business risk. The challenge lies in translating technical vulnerabilities into tangible business impacts, which is crucial for effective communication with stakeholders and for prioritizing remediation efforts. A penetration tester must move beyond simply identifying flaws to understanding the potential consequences for the organization. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough impact assessment that considers the confidentiality, integrity, and availability (CIA triad) of the data and systems affected by the identified vulnerabilities. This assessment must be grounded in the organization's specific business context, regulatory obligations e.g., GDPR, CCPA if applicable to the jurisdiction, though for GPEN, the focus is generally on U.S. federal regulations like HIPAA, PCI DSS, SOX, and NIST guidelines, and potential financial, reputational, and operational damage. By quantifying or qualitatively describing these impacts, the penetration tester provides actionable intelligence that enables informed decision-making by management. This aligns with professional ethical standards that require testers to act in the best interest of the client and to provide clear, relevant, and useful findings. Incorrect approach is analysis. Focusing solely on the technical severity of a vulnerability without considering its business context is a significant failure. For example, a high-severity SQL injection vulnerability might be technically critical, but if it only affects a non-sensitive, publicly accessible page with no user data, its business impact is far lower than a medium-severity vulnerability that could expose customer PII. This approach fails to meet the client's need for risk-based prioritization and can lead to misallocation of resources. Reporting only the number of vulnerabilities found, regardless of their nature or potential impact, is another professionally unacceptable approach. This provides a superficial overview and does not offer any insight into the actual risk to the organization. It is akin to a doctor reporting the number of symptoms a patient has without diagnosing the underlying illness or its severity. This approach lacks the depth required for effective risk management and can lead to a false sense of security or undue alarm. Providing a detailed technical report of every discovered vulnerability without any attempt to explain the potential business consequences is also insufficient. While technical accuracy is vital, it is only one part of the equation. Without understanding the so what, the potential impact on the business, the client may struggle to prioritize remediation efforts. This can lead to critical vulnerabilities being overlooked due to a lack of clear justification for their importance. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based approach to penetration testing. This involves understanding the client's business objectives, critical assets, and regulatory landscape. When vulnerabilities are identified, the next step is to assess their potential impact in terms of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. This assessment should be contextualized by the likelihood of exploitation and the potential business consequences, financial loss, reputational damage, legal penalties, operational disruption. Findings should then be communicated in a clear, concise, and actionable manner, prioritizing those with the highest business impact. This ensures that the client can effectively allocate resources to address the most significant risks. Question 11. The control framework reveals that penetration test reports must effectively communicate findings to diverse audiences. Considering U.S. regulatory expectations for demonstrating due diligence in cybersecurity, which of the following approaches to penetration test report content and format best satisfies these requirements? Option A. A report that is primarily a technical log of all commands executed and tools used during the test, with minimal explanation of the findings' implications for the business. Option B. A report that lists all identified vulnerabilities without any prioritization or specific recommendations for remediation, assuming the client's technical team can infer the necessary actions. Option C. A report that includes a detailed executive summary outlining the overall risk posture and business impact, followed by a categorized list of vulnerabilities with clear descriptions, evidence, risk ratings, and prioritized, actionable remediation recommendations for each. Option D. A report that uses highly technical language and complex jargon throughout, making it accessible only to highly specialized security personnel. The correct answer is C. A report that includes a detailed executive summary outlining the overall risk posture and business impact, followed by a categorized list of vulnerabilities with clear descriptions, evidence, risk ratings, and prioritized, actionable remediation recommendations for each. Explanation. The control framework reveals that penetration testing is a critical component of an organization's security posture, and the effectiveness of these tests hinges on clear, actionable reporting. The challenge in this scenario lies in balancing the technical detail required to satisfy security professionals with the clarity needed for executive stakeholders to understand risk and make informed decisions. A penetration test report is not merely a technical document. It's a communication tool that bridges the gap between technical findings and business impact. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing data protection and financial services in the U.S., mandate that organizations have robust security controls and demonstrate due diligence in identifying and mitigating vulnerabilities. A well-structured report is essential for this demonstration. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the principles of effective communication and risk management, which are implicitly or explicitly required by U.S. regulatory frameworks like NIST SB 800-53, which influences many U.S. compliance standards, and the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA, for financial institutions. A report that categorizes findings by risk level, provides clear descriptions of vulnerabilities, details the potential business impact, and offers specific, prioritized remediation steps, ensures that the organization can effectively address the identified weaknesses. This approach facilitates informed decision-making by both technical teams and management, leading to a stronger security posture and compliance with regulatory expectations. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on technical jargon without business context fails to communicate the true risk to non-technical stakeholders, potentially leading to under-resourced remediation efforts and non-compliance with due diligence requirements. This neglects the ethical obligation to provide a report that is useful to the organization's overall security management. Another incorrect approach that omits clear remediation steps leaves the organization with findings but no clear path forward, hindering effective risk mitigation and potentially violating the spirit of regulatory requirements that expect proactive security management. A report that is overly verbose and lacks conciseness can obscure critical findings, making it difficult for readers to grasp the most important issues, thereby failing to meet the professional standard of clear and effective communication. Professionals should approach penetration test reporting by first understanding the audience. The report must be structured to cater to different levels of technical expertise. A common and effective practice is to include an executive summary that highlights key risks and business impacts, followed by detailed technical sections for security teams. Prioritization of findings based on risk E, G, high, medium, low is crucial for guiding remediation efforts. Each finding should include a clear description of the vulnerability, evidence of exploitation, potential impact, and actionable remediation recommendations. This structured approach ensures that the report serves its intended purpose, to inform, guide, and ultimately improve the organization's security. Question 12. Regulatory review indicates that a financial institution's customer-facing API, which handles sensitive personal and transactional data, is to be included in a penetration test. The API utilizes REST-default principles and employs OAuth 2.0 for authentication. The primary objective is to identify vulnerabilities that could lead to unauthorized data access or manipulation. Which of the following approaches best balances thoroughness with the need to maintain service availability and adhere to ethical testing standards? Option A. Immediately deploy a suite of automated API vulnerability scanners against all exposed endpoints to quickly identify and report common security misconfigurations. Option B. focus solely on attempting to bypass the OAuth 2.0 authentication mechanism by brute-forcing tokens or exploiting known weaknesses in the OAuth implementation. Option C. Conduct extensive fuzzing on all API parameters with a wide range of malicious payloads to uncover any potential input validation vulnerabilities, without prior analysis of the API's expected behavior. Option D. Begin by attempting to enumerate all API endpoints and parameters, followed by targeted testing of identified vulnerabilities such as injection flaws, broken object-level authorization, and insecure direct object references, while meticulously documenting all interactions and their outcomes. The correct answer is D. Begin by attempting to enumerate all API endpoints and parameters, followed by targeted testing of identified vulnerabilities such as injection flaws, broken object-level authorization, and insecure direct object references, while meticulously documenting all interactions and their outcomes. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing, balancing the need for thorough testing of web services and APIs with the potential for disruption and the sensitive nature of the data they handle. The professional challenge lies in identifying vulnerabilities without causing denial of service conditions or unauthorized data exfiltration, all while adhering to the defined scope and legal boundaries. The rapid evolution of API technologies and the increasing reliance on them for critical business functions necessitate a nuanced approach that goes beyond simple vulnerability scanning. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a phased methodology that prioritizes reconnaissance and non-intrusive techniques before escalating to more aggressive testing. This aligns with best professional practices and ethical guidelines for penetration testing, which emphasize minimizing impact and operating within agreed-upon parameters. Specifically, for web services and APIs, this means starting with understanding the API's structure, authentication mechanisms, and data formats through passive observation and analysis of documentation. Subsequently, controlled, targeted testing of identified potential weaknesses, such as input validation flaws, broken access controls, and insecure direct object references, is performed. This methodical approach ensures that the testing is both effective in uncovering vulnerabilities and responsible in its execution, respecting the operational integrity of the target system. This aligns with the general principles of responsible disclosure and ethical hacking, which are implicitly expected within the GIAC framework, even if not explicitly codified in a single U.S. regulation for this specific context. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately attempting to exploit known vulnerabilities without prior reconnaissance or understanding of the API's context. This is professionally unacceptable because it increases the risk of unintended consequences, such as system instability or data corruption, and may exceed the authorized scope of testing. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the potential impact on the client's operations. Another incorrect approach is to solely rely on automated scanning tools without manual verification or in-depth analysis. While automated tools can identify common vulnerabilities, they often produce false positives and can miss complex, logic-based flaws specific to API interactions. This approach is insufficient for comprehensive security assessment and can lead to a false sense of security or unnecessary remediation efforts. A third incorrect approach is to disregard the API's authentication and authorization mechanisms and attempt to access sensitive data directly. This is a severe ethical and potentially legal failure, as it constitutes unauthorized access and data breach, even within a penetration testing engagement, if not explicitly permitted and scoped. It violates the fundamental principles of trust and authorization that underpin professional penetration testing. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based, phased approach to testing web services and APIs. This involves 1. Understanding the scope and objectives. Clearly define what is in scope, what types of testing are permitted, and the acceptable level of risk. 2. Reconnaissance and enumeration. Gather information about the API, including its endpoints, parameters, authentication methods, and data formats, using both passive and active techniques. 3. Vulnerability identification. Analyze the gathered information to identify potential weaknesses based on common API security risks, e.g., OWASP API Security Top 10. 4. Controlled exploitation. If authorized and deemed necessary, attempt to exploit identified vulnerabilities in a controlled manner, carefully monitoring system behavior. 5. Reporting. Document all findings, including the methodology used, identified vulnerabilities, their potential impact, and actionable remediation recommendations. This structured process ensures that testing is effective, efficient, and ethically sound, minimizing risk to the client's operations while maximizing the value of the security assessment. Question 13. The assessment process reveals that during the initial reconnaissance phase, a critical server is identified that appears to be part of the client's internal network, based on its IP addressing scheme and naming conventions. However, this server was not explicitly listed in the statement of work, so, as either in scope or out of scope. The SOW provides a general description of the network segments to be tested, but lacks granular detail for this specific server. The penetration tester is unsure if this server should be included in the assessment. Option A. Immediately cease all testing activities and inform the client that the scope is too ambiguous to proceed until a completely revised SOW is provided. Option B. Proceed with testing the server, assuming it is in scope due to its apparent integration with the client's internal network, and address any scope creep concerns in the final report. Option C. Ignore the server and continue with the assessment of explicitly defined in-scope systems, without mentioning the existence of this ambiguous server in any documentation or communication. Option D. Document the ambiguity. Formally request written clarification from the client regarding the server's inclusion in the scope, and await their response before proceeding with any testing of that server. The correct answer is D. Document the ambiguity. Formally request written clarification from the client regarding the server's inclusion in the scope, and await their response before proceeding with any testing of that server. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a common challenge in penetration testing, balancing the need for comprehensive testing with the imperative to respect defined boundaries and avoid unintended consequences. This scenario is professionally challenging because the tester must interpret ambiguous information about the target environment and make critical decisions about scope without direct, real-time clarification from the client. The potential for misinterpretation can lead to either an incomplete assessment, missing critical vulnerabilities, or an unauthorized intrusion, violating the agreed-upon scope, both of which have significant professional and legal ramifications. Careful judgment is required to navigate this ambiguity while adhering to the principles of ethical hacking and client trust. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes clear communication, adherence to the established scope, and a proactive stance in seeking clarification. By documenting the ambiguity and formally requesting clarification before proceeding with testing potentially out-of-scope systems, the penetration tester demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and professional diligence. This aligns with the core principles of penetration testing engagements, which are built on trust and explicit authorization. Specifically, in the context of U.S. regulations and common industry best practices for penetration testing, such as those outlined by NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, guidelines for security assessments, unauthorized access or testing of systems not explicitly included in the scope is a direct violation. This proactive approach ensures that the testing remains within the agreed-upon legal and contractual boundaries, protecting both the tester and the client from potential liabilities. It also ensures the integrity of the assessment by confirming that all testing activities are authorized and relevant to the client's objectives. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with testing the ambiguous system without clarification represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This action constitutes unauthorized access, which is illegal and a breach of professional ethics. It violates the principle of explicit consent, a cornerstone of any penetration testing engagement. Such an action could lead to legal repercussions for the tester and the testing firm, including civil lawsuits and potential criminal charges, depending on the nature of the system and the data accessed. Furthermore, it erodes client trust, which is paramount in the cybersecurity field. Another incorrect approach, that of ignoring the ambiguous system entirely and not documenting the ambiguity, is also professionally unacceptable. While it avoids the risk of unauthorized access, it fails to deliver a comprehensive assessment. The client may have intended for this system to be in scope, and by not flagging the ambiguity, the tester misses an opportunity to identify potential risks. This can lead to a false sense of security for the client and a potential failure to meet the objectives of the penetration test. Ethically, a penetration tester has a responsibility to provide a thorough and accurate assessment within the agreed-upon scope, and this includes highlighting potential gaps or ambiguities that could impact the overall security posture. The professional reasoning framework for such situations involves a structured decision-making process. First, thoroughly review all provided documentation, including the statement of work, and any pre-engagement questionnaires, to identify explicit inclusions and exclusions. Second, if ambiguity exists, meticulously document the specific nature of the ambiguity, including the systems, networks, or applications in question and the reasons for uncertainty. Third, immediately communicate this documented ambiguity to the designated client contact, requesting explicit clarification and authorization. This communication should be in writing to maintain a clear record. Fourth, await explicit written confirmation or denial of inclusion before proceeding with any testing activities related to the ambiguous elements. If clarification is not received within a reasonable time frame, the tester should proceed with the assessment based on the most conservative interpretation of the scope, i.e., treating the ambiguous system as out of scope, and clearly document this decision and its rationale in the final report. This systematic approach ensures that all actions are authorized, documented, and aligned with professional and ethical standards. Question 14. The audit findings indicate that the web application's session management mechanisms are susceptible to exploitation. During testing, which of the following approaches would most effectively demonstrate the risk of session hijacking and session fixation to the client, while adhering to professional ethical standards and typical U.S. regulatory expectations for data protection? Option A. Attempting to exploit identified session tokens to impersonate authenticated users and demonstrating the ability to fixate a user's session to a predictable, attacker-controlled session ID before they authenticate. Option B. Probing session management functionalities for theoretical weaknesses without attempting to exploit them in a live environment. Option C. Documenting the format of session tokens and noting any observed patterns without attempting to manipulate or hijack active sessions. Option D. Conducting reconnaissance on external systems to identify potential session management vulnerabilities that could be leveraged against the target application. The correct answer is A. Attempting to exploit identified session tokens to impersonate authenticated users and demonstrating the ability to fixate a user's session to a predictable, attacker-controlled session ID before they authenticate. Explanation. The audit findings indicate a critical vulnerability in the application's session management, specifically concerning the potential for session hijacking and fixation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it directly impacts user privacy, data integrity, and the overall security posture of the application. A penetration tester must not only identify the vulnerability, but also assess its exploitability and potential impact within the defined scope and regulatory environment. The challenge lies in balancing the need for thorough testing with the ethical and legal boundaries of the engagement, ensuring that testing activities do not inadvertently cause harm or violate privacy. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the identification and reporting of the most severe session management risks in a manner that is actionable for the client. By focusing on techniques that directly exploit session fixation to gain unauthorized access or session hijacking to impersonate legitimate users, the tester is addressing the core security concerns related to session integrity. This aligns with general cybersecurity best practices, and within the U.S. regulatory framework relevant to many GPEN engagements, would fall under the purview of ensuring reasonable security measures to protect sensitive information, as often mandated by regulations like HIPAA for healthcare data or PCI DSS for payment card information, where session integrity is paramount. The reporting of such findings would be crucial for the client to implement effective remediation, thereby fulfilling their own compliance obligations. An incorrect approach that involves passively observing session tokens without attempting to exploit them is insufficient. While it might identify weak token generation, it fails to demonstrate the actual risk of hijacking or fixation, thus not providing the client with a clear understanding of the exploitability and potential impact. This could lead to a false sense of security or delayed remediation, potentially violating the spirit of due diligence required by regulations. Another incorrect approach, such as attempting to exploit session management vulnerabilities on systems outside the agreed-upon scope, is a severe ethical and legal failure. This constitutes unauthorized access and can lead to significant legal repercussions for both the tester and the client, and directly contravenes the principles of ethical hacking and the contractual obligations of a penetration test. It demonstrates a lack of professional judgment and disregard for established security protocols and legal boundaries. A third incorrect approach, focusing solely on theoretical vulnerabilities without practical demonstration of exploitability, is also professionally deficient. While theoretical understanding is important, a penetration test's value lies in proving real-world risks. Without demonstrating how session hijacking or fixation can be practically achieved, the client may not fully appreciate the severity of the issue or the urgency of remediation, potentially leading to non-compliance with security mandates. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the engagement scope, objectives, and the relevant regulatory landscape. Testers must prioritize testing activities that directly address the most critical security risks, such as session management vulnerabilities, and demonstrate their exploitability. They should always operate within legal and ethical boundaries, obtaining explicit authorization for all testing activities and reporting findings clearly and concisely to enable effective remediation. A risk-based approach, focusing on the potential impact of vulnerabilities, is essential for prioritizing testing efforts and reporting. Question 15. Implementation of a penetration test on a client's network has revealed a low-privilege user account with access to sensitive configuration files. The penetration tester has identified a potential vulnerability that could allow for privilege escalation to a local administrator account. The rules of engagement explicitly permit the identification and reporting of privilege escalation vulnerabilities, but do not grant explicit permission to exploit them to gain full administrative control or to modify system configurations. What is the most professional and legally compliant course of action? Option A. Attempt to exploit the vulnerability to gain local administrator access, and if successful, immediately revert any changes made and report the findings. Option B. Proceed with exploiting the vulnerability to gain local administrator access, then document the administrative access and any further vulnerabilities discovered from that elevated position. Option C. Document the identified vulnerability and the steps required to exploit it, including the potential impact of achieving administrative privileges, and report these findings to the client without further exploitation. Option D. Immediately cease all testing activities related to this system and report the discovery of the potential escalation path as a critical security finding without providing any technical details on the exploit. The correct answer is C. Document the identified vulnerability and the steps required to exploit it, including the potential impact of achieving administrative privileges, and report these findings to the client without further exploitation. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing: the ethical and legal boundaries surrounding privilege escalation. A penetration tester, even with explicit authorization for a specific scope, must operate within the defined rules of engagement and adhere to relevant U.S. regulations and ethical guidelines. The core challenge lies in balancing the objective of identifying vulnerabilities with the imperative to avoid unauthorized access or actions that could be construed as malicious. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the agreed-upon scope and legal frameworks. By documenting findings and reporting them to the client without further exploitation beyond what is explicitly permitted, the tester upholds ethical standards and avoids violating U.S. laws such as the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFA. This approach ensures that the testing remains within the bounds of authorized activity, protecting both the tester and the client from legal repercussions. An incorrect approach that involves escalating privileges beyond the agreed scope, even with the intent to demonstrate risk, constitutes a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This action directly violates the CFA by exceeding authorized access. Ethically, it breaches the trust established in the rules of engagement and could lead to severe consequences, including legal penalties and damage to professional reputation. Another incorrect approach, such as intentionally causing system instability or data corruption during privilege escalation, is also a severe ethical and regulatory violation. This goes beyond demonstrating vulnerability and enters the realm of unauthorized damage, which is explicitly prohibited and illegal under U.S. law. It also fails to provide actionable intelligence for remediation and instead creates new problems. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding and documentation of the rules of engagement. Before any testing activity, especially those involving sensitive areas like privilege escalation, the tester must confirm the explicit authorization and scope. If a potential escalation path is identified, the tester should pause and consult the rules of engagement, and if necessary, the client to determine the next steps. The guiding principle should always be to operate within authorized boundaries, focusing on identifying and reporting vulnerabilities rather than exploiting them beyond what is permitted. This iterative process of authorization, execution, and reporting ensures compliance and ethical conduct. Question 16. Risk assessment procedures indicate that the organization's network is protected by an intrusion prevention system, IPS, that is known to be effective against common evasion techniques. During a penetration test, you are tasked with assessing the IPS's resilience against more advanced threats. Which of the following approaches best aligns with professional penetration testing standards and ethical guidelines for this scenario? Option A. Employing fragmentation techniques and protocol manipulation methods that are documented in publicly available security research and have been pre-approved in the penetration test scope of work. Option B. Socially engineering an administrator to provide credentials that would allow direct access to the IPS configuration to manually disable it. Option C. Attempting to discover and exploit zero-day vulnerabilities in the IPS itself to gain administrative access and disable it for the duration of the test. Option D. Using a broad range of unapproved, publicly available exploit kits to test the IPS's ability to detect and block known malicious payloads. The correct answer is A. Employing fragmentation techniques and protocol manipulation methods that are documented in publicly available security research and have been pre-approved in the penetration test scope of work. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing: the need to bypass security controls like intrusion detection systems, IDs, and intrusion prevention systems, IPS, to accurately assess an organization's true security posture. The challenge lies in balancing the need for effective testing with the ethical and legal boundaries of authorized access. Misinterpreting the scope or employing unauthorized techniques can lead to severe consequences, including legal repercussions and damage to the tester's reputation. The inherent adversarial nature of IDS/IPS evasion requires a deep understanding of network protocols and system vulnerabilities, demanding careful consideration of the potential impact of each technique. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves utilizing documented and authorized IDS/IPS evasion techniques that are within the agreed-upon scope of the penetration test. This includes employing methods such as fragmentation, protocol manipulation, or polymorphic payloads, provided these are explicitly permitted by the client's rules of engagement. Such techniques are considered best professional practice because they directly address the objective of testing the effectiveness of security controls against sophisticated threats. Adhering to the scope ensures that the penetration test remains legal and ethical, preventing unauthorized access or damage. Furthermore, documenting these techniques and their outcomes provides valuable insights to the client about their security system's resilience and areas for improvement, aligning with the professional duty to provide actionable intelligence. This approach is supported by industry best practices and ethical guidelines for penetration testing, which emphasize authorized and controlled testing methodologies. Incorrect approaches analysis. Employing techniques that are not explicitly authorized within the scope of the penetration test, such as exploiting zero-day vulnerabilities discovered during the test without prior approval, constitutes a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This crosses the boundary from authorized testing to unauthorized access, potentially violating laws related to computer misuse and data privacy. It also breaches the trust established with the client. Using publicly available but unapproved exploit kits without understanding their full impact or potential for collateral damage is another failure. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the potential consequences, which could include disrupting services or compromising systems beyond the agreed-upon scope. Such actions can lead to legal penalties and professional sanctions. Furthermore, attempting to disable or bypass security controls through methods that are not part of the agreed-upon testing methodology, like social engineering to gain administrative credentials for disabling the IPS, is a clear ethical violation and likely a breach of contract. This demonstrates a failure to adhere to the agreed-upon testing parameters and a lack of professional integrity. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach IDS/IPS evasion by first thoroughly understanding and adhering to the client's rules of engagement and the defined scope of the penetration test. Any proposed evasion technique must be evaluated against these parameters. If a technique is not explicitly permitted, the tester must seek explicit authorization from the client before proceeding. Documentation is paramount. All techniques used, their rationale, and their outcomes must be meticulously recorded. This ensures transparency and provides a clear audit trail. In situations where a technique might push the boundaries of the scope, open communication with the client is essential. The decision-making process should prioritize legality, ethics, and the client's explicit consent, ensuring that the penetration test remains a valuable and authorized assessment rather than an unauthorized intrusion. Question 17. Operational review demonstrates that a client's remote access VPN infrastructure is a critical component for their distributed workforce. The penetration tester is tasked with assessing its security. Which of the following approaches best balances the need for thorough vulnerability identification with the imperative to maintain operational stability and adhere to professional ethical standards? Option A. Perform aggressive denial of service testing to gauge the resilience of the VPN gateway without prior notification to the client. Option B. Immediately initiate brute force attacks against VPN authentication mechanisms to quickly identify weak credentials. Option C. Focus exclusively on identifying publicly disclosed vulnerabilities for the specific VPN software in use, assuming that patching is the only necessary remediation. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive review of VPN configurations, authentication protocols, and access controls, followed by targeted, authorized exploitation attempts based on identified weaknesses and a pre-approved testing plan. The correct answer is B. Immediately initiate brute force attacks against VPN authentication mechanisms to quickly identify weak credentials. Explanation. Scenario analysis. The scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing, assessing the security of remote access solutions, specifically VPNs, without disrupting critical business operations. The difficulty lies in balancing the need for thorough testing to identify vulnerabilities with the imperative to maintain service availability and data integrity. Misconfigurations or aggressive testing techniques could lead to denial of service conditions, unauthorized access, or data breaches, all of which carry significant regulatory and reputational consequences. The tester must navigate a complex landscape of technical controls, user access policies, and potential business impact. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a phased, risk-based methodology that prioritizes understanding the existing security posture before initiating active testing. This begins with a comprehensive review of VPN configurations, including encryption protocols, authentication methods, e.g., multi-factor authentication, access control lists, and logging mechanisms. It then progresses to simulating realistic attack vectors against the remote access infrastructure, such as attempting to bypass authentication, exploit known vulnerabilities in VPN clients or servers, or test for weak session management. This approach is best professional practice because it aligns with the principles of responsible disclosure and minimizes the risk of unintended consequences. It allows for the identification of vulnerabilities in a controlled manner, providing actionable intelligence to the client for remediation. This methodical approach is implicitly supported by general IT security, best practices, and ethical guidelines that emphasize minimizing harm and acting with due diligence, which are foundational to professional conduct in cybersecurity assessments. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that immediately attempts to brute force VPN credentials without prior reconnaissance or authorization is professionally unacceptable. This constitutes an unauthorized access attempt and violates ethical principles of penetration testing, which require explicit scope and permission. Such actions could lead to account lockouts, triggering security alerts, and potentially disrupting legitimate user access, which is a regulatory failure if it impacts business continuity without proper authorization. Another incorrect approach would be to solely focus on identifying publicly known vulnerabilities in the VPN software, without considering the specific configuration and deployed security controls. While identifying known CVEs is part of a comprehensive assessment, neglecting to test the effectiveness of implemented defenses like strong authentication or network segmentation leaves critical gaps. This failure to conduct a holistic assessment can lead to a false sense of security and is professionally deficient as it does not provide a complete picture of the actual risk. Finally, an approach that involves aggressive denial of service, DoS, testing against the VPN infrastructure without explicit, written consent and a predefined testing window is highly problematic. This directly risks disrupting business operations, which can have severe financial and legal ramifications for the client. It violates the principle of do no harm and can lead to regulatory penalties related to service availability and business continuity, especially in regulated industries. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with clearly defining the scope and objectives of the engagement in collaboration with the client. This includes understanding the business criticality of the remote access infrastructure. A risk assessment should then be performed to identify potential impacts of various testing techniques. The testing plan should be developed based on this risk assessment, prioritizing non-intrusive reconnaissance and configuration review before moving to more active exploitation. Continuous communication with the client throughout the engagement is crucial, especially when encountering unexpected findings or when planning to execute potentially disruptive tests. This structured, risk-aware, and communicative approach ensures that the penetration test is both effective in identifying vulnerabilities and responsible in its execution. Question 18. Process analysis reveals a penetration tester has identified a potential vulnerability in the SSH service of a client's network, specifically related to weak authentication configurations. The tester needs to demonstrate the exploitability of this weakness to the client. Which of the following approaches best balances the need for demonstration with adherence to U.S. regulatory frameworks and professional ethics? Option A. Performing a denial-of-service attack against the DNS server to demonstrate its susceptibility to disruption, as this is a critical network service. Option B. Developing and deploying an exploit for a recently discovered, unpatched zero-day vulnerability in the SMTP service to showcase the potential for advanced threats. Option C. Attempting to leverage a known, documented SSH vulnerability that allows for authenticated access with elevated privileges by exploiting a misconfiguration in the authentication protocol without impacting service availability or requiring brute force methods. Option D. Initiating a brute force attack against the FTP service to gain unauthorized access to user credentials, as this is a common network service that is often poorly secured. The correct answer is C. Attempting to leverage a known, documented SSH vulnerability that allows for authenticated access with elevated privileges by exploiting a misconfiguration in the authentication protocol without impacting service availability or requiring brute force methods. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing, balancing the need to demonstrate the exploitability of network services with the imperative to avoid causing disruption or unauthorized access that could violate legal or ethical boundaries. The professional challenge lies in identifying a vulnerability that is demonstrably exploitable without triggering security controls or impacting service availability, all while adhering strictly to the scope of the engagement and relevant U.S. regulations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it focuses on identifying and demonstrating a specific, documented vulnerability in a network service, SSH, that can be exploited without requiring brute force attacks or causing service degradation. This aligns with the ethical obligation to conduct testing within agreed-upon parameters and to minimize risk to the client's operations. Furthermore, it adheres to U.S. legal frameworks by focusing on authorized testing of identified weaknesses, rather than engaging in activities that could be construed as unauthorized access or denial of service, which are prohibited under laws like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act (CFA). The goal is to provide actionable intelligence, not to cause harm. An incorrect approach that involves attempting to brute force FTP credentials is professionally unacceptable for several reasons. Ethically, it can lead to account lockouts, disrupt legitimate user access, and potentially trigger intrusion detection systems, all of which fall outside the typical scope of a vulnerability demonstration and could be seen as a denial-of-service attack. Legally, depending on the client's network configuration and the terms of the engagement, repeated failed login attempts could be interpreted as an unauthorized access attempt, potentially violating the CFA. Another incorrect approach, attempting to exploit a zero-day vulnerability in SMTP without prior authorization or a clear plan to contain the exploit, is highly risky and unprofessional. Ethically, it exposes the client to significant, unmanaged risk of data compromise or service disruption. Legally, exploiting an unknown vulnerability without explicit permission could be seen as unauthorized access and could have severe legal repercussions for the tester and their organization, even if the intent was to demonstrate a potential risk. A professional decision-making process for similar situations involves a thorough understanding of the engagement scope, a risk assessment of potential exploitation methods, and a clear communication channel with the client. For attempting any exploit, a penetration tester should 1. Confirm the vulnerability is within the agreed-upon scope. 2. Research known exploit methods and their potential impact. 3. Prioritize methods that demonstrate the vulnerability with minimal risk of disruption or unauthorized access. 4. Obtain explicit client approval for any potentially disruptive or sensitive testing activities. 5. Have a rollback or containment plan in place. This structured approach ensures that testing is effective, ethical, and legally compliant. Question 19. Investigation of network penetration testing methodologies. Which approach best balances the imperative to discover vulnerabilities with the need to minimize operational disruption and adhere to professional ethical standards? Option A. Conducting comprehensive reconnaissance and vulnerability scanning, followed by a phased approach to controlled exploitation, starting with less intrusive methods and escalating only as necessary and approved. Option B. Relying exclusively on automated scanning tools to cover the widest possible attack surface, without manual validation of findings. Option C. Immediately initiating aggressive exploitation techniques against critical systems to quickly identify the most severe weaknesses. Option D. Focusing solely on vulnerabilities that are easily exploitable and pose the least risk of causing system instability, regardless of their potential impact. The correct answer is C. Immediately initiating aggressive exploitation techniques against critical systems to quickly identify the most severe weaknesses. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in network penetration testing, where a tester must balance the need for thoroughness with the potential for disruption. The core difficulty lies in identifying and exploiting vulnerabilities without causing unintended service degradation or data loss, which could have significant business and legal ramifications. The tester must exercise professional judgment to determine the acceptable level of risk associated with different testing methodologies. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a phased methodology that prioritizes non-intrusive techniques before escalating to more impactful ones. This aligns with best professional practices and ethical guidelines for penetration testing. Specifically, it emphasizes reconnaissance, vulnerability scanning, and controlled exploitation attempts. This methodical progression allows for early detection of potential issues and provides opportunities to adjust the testing strategy to minimize risk. Regulatory frameworks, while not explicitly detailed here as the jurisdiction is not specified, generally mandate that testers act with due care and avoid causing harm. This approach demonstrates due care by attempting to understand the environment and potential impacts before proceeding with more aggressive actions. It also supports the principle of minimizing disruption, a key ethical consideration in professional services. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that immediately attempts to exploit critical systems without prior reconnaissance or assessment is professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the potential impact on the client's operations. Such actions could lead to service outages, data corruption, or security breaches that the client did not authorize or anticipate, potentially violating contractual agreements and leading to legal liability. Ethically, it represents a failure to act in the client's best interest and a reckless disregard for their business continuity. Another incorrect approach is to solely rely on automated tools without manual verification and analysis. While automated tools are essential, they can produce false positives or miss nuanced vulnerabilities. Over-reliance on them without expert human oversight can lead to inaccurate findings or missed critical risks. This can result in the client making incorrect security decisions based on flawed data, which is a failure of professional responsibility. It also fails to demonstrate the depth of analysis expected from a skilled penetration tester. Finally, an approach that ignores or downplays the client's stated concerns or risk tolerance is also professionally flawed. A penetration test must be conducted within the agreed-upon scope and with consideration for the client's business context. Ignoring these factors can lead to testing that is either too aggressive or not aggressive enough, failing to meet the client's objectives, and potentially causing unnecessary disruption or failing to identify critical risks relevant to their specific environment. This is a failure to adhere to the agreed-upon engagement parameters and a lack of client-centric professional conduct. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based, phased approach to network penetration testing. This involves 1. Understanding the client's objectives, scope, and risk tolerance. 2. Conducting thorough reconnaissance to map the target environment. 3. Performing non-intrusive vulnerability scanning and analysis. 4. Prioritizing and attempting controlled exploitation of identified vulnerabilities, starting with less impactful methods. 5. Continuously monitoring for and mitigating any unintended impacts. 6. Documenting all findings and actions meticulously. This systematic process ensures that the testing is effective, efficient, and conducted with the utmost professionalism and consideration for the client's business operations. Question 20. What factors determine the appropriateness of information gathering and reconnaissance techniques employed during a penetration test, specifically within the context of U.S. regulatory frameworks and common industry best practices for penetration testing? Option A. The explicit scope of work defined in the penetration testing contract, the client's explicit written authorization for specific active reconnaissance methods, and adherence to U.S. privacy regulations such as HIPAA or GDPR, if applicable to the client's data handling. Option B. The tester's personal judgment regarding what information might be useful for the test, without the need for explicit client consent for any reconnaissance activity beyond initial engagement. Option C. The availability of information on public search engines and social media platforms, assuming all publicly accessible data is fair game for collection and analysis without further consideration. Option D. The perceived technical feasibility of accessing target systems and the potential for discovering high-impact vulnerabilities, regardless of explicit authorization or contractual limitations. The correct answer is A. The explicit scope of work defined in the penetration testing contract, the client's explicit written authorization for specific active reconnaissance methods, and adherence to U.S. privacy regulations such as HIPAA or GDPR, if applicable to the client's data handling. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because penetration testers must balance the need for comprehensive information gathering with the ethical and legal boundaries of their engagement. The core difficulty lies in distinguishing between permissible reconnaissance activities and those that could be construed as unauthorized access or a violation of privacy, especially when dealing with publicly available information that might still be sensitive or protected by specific regulations. Careful judgment is required to ensure all actions remain within the agreed-upon scope and adhere to relevant legal frameworks. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes actions that are explicitly permitted by the engagement agreement and align with the principle of least privilege for information gathering. This involves leveraging open-source intelligence, OSINT, techniques that do not require direct interaction with the target systems, such as analyzing publicly accessible websites, social media profiles, and publicly registered domain information. Such methods are generally considered ethical and legal as they utilize information already exposed to the public domain. Furthermore, this approach aligns with the spirit of penetration testing, which aims to identify vulnerabilities without causing disruption or unauthorized access. Adherence to the scope of work and obtaining explicit consent for any active reconnaissance are paramount, reflecting professional integrity and compliance with the implicit trust placed in the tester. An incorrect approach that involves attempting to access internal network resources through methods like port scanning without prior authorization is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This constitutes unauthorized access, which is illegal and violates the terms of most penetration testing engagements. It can lead to legal repercussions, damage to the client's reputation, and a breach of professional ethics. Another incorrect approach, such as social engineering tactics that involve impersonating legitimate employees to extract information, is also ethically and potentially legally problematic. While sometimes included in scope, without explicit, informed consent and clear guidelines, it can be considered deceptive and harmful. It violates principles of honesty and can lead to unintended consequences for the target organization and its employees. Finally, an approach that involves scraping large amounts of data from public websites without regard for terms of service or potential privacy implications can also be problematic. While the data is public, the method of collection might violate usage policies or inadvertently collect personally identifiable information, PI, in a manner that is not compliant with data protection regulations, even if the initial data was publicly accessible. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough review and understanding of the penetration testing engagement scope and contract. This includes identifying any explicit restrictions on reconnaissance activities. Subsequently, testers should prioritize passive information gathering techniques that rely on publicly available data. For any active reconnaissance, such as port scanning or vulnerability probing, explicit written authorization must be obtained from the client, detailing the specific targets, methods, and timeframes. Ethical considerations, such as minimizing potential disruption and avoiding the collection of sensitive personal data, unless explicitly permitted and necessary for the test, should guide all actions. Regular communication with the client to clarify any ambiguities or report findings is also a critical component of professional decision-making.